Chapter 1. The Painted Horse at Dawn. The carousel stood in stillness under the bruised hues of early dawn, its painted steeds frozen mid-prance. Mist from the Thames drifted inland like a hush settling over the village of Marbury-on-Avon. And yet, amid the painted smiles and carnival cheer of the silent fairground, one horse was different. Its garish red saddle was stained with something real, not paint. A thin scream pierced the morning air. It came from Celia Burnham, who had risen early to walk her beagle past the fairgrounds before the village stirred to life. She stood trembling beside the carousel, her gloved hand at her mouth, staring at what was slumped across the horse's neck. The body was dressed in a linen suit, crumpled now, the collar stained with blood. One arm dangled stiffly down the horse's side, the other clutched at the mane like the man had died mid-mount. A paper ticket fluttered in his lapel, an entry pass for the opening gala of the Marbury Spring Fair, scheduled for that very night. And his face, slack in death, was unmistakably that of Lord Charles Everdale. By mid-morning, the town buzzed like a hornet's nest, struck with a stone. The late Lord Everdale was no stranger to controversy. A man of fortune and charm, he was beloved by some and barely tolerated by others. Owner of Everdale Estates and recently returned from abroad, he had only days earlier declared plans to sell the sprawling Burnley Grange estate for a modern housing development. The announcement had set the village committee aflame with indignation, whispers of betrayal, greed, and threats. The news of his death swept through the countryside, first as rumour, then confirmed fact. Constable Fay was first on the scene, pale, out of breath, and far too green for a matter this severe. He sealed off the fairground and awaited the arrival of Chief Inspector Alec Grange, a man built like a cricket bat and every bit as blunt. "It was Miss Burnham who found him?" Grange asked, scribbling notes as the young woman sat wrapped in a tartan blanket, her eyes wide and dry. "Yes," she whispered. "He looked like a rag doll. His head was just lolling there." "And you didn't touch the body?" "No, sir. I called the operator, Mr. Flinch." Grange turned toward the red and white striped tent, where Leonard Flinch, owner of the travelling carousel, stood wringing his hat like it had insulted him. "I got up early, sir, to oil the gears," Flinch stammered. "We'd only just set up last night. Everything locked properly. Nobody's supposed to be near the horses before 10, I swear it." Inspector Grange surveyed the area. No signs of forced entry, no sign of a struggle, no blood trail leading in. It was as though Lord Everdale had simply materialized onto the carousel in the dead of night. Already dead. "Who last saw him alive?" Grange asked. "Couldn't say," Flinch replied. "Though he was at the village gala. Committee meeting yesterday, wasn't he?" Indeed, the committee had met in the old rectory to discuss the fair's schedule. Present were Celia Burnham, Mrs. Judith Langridge, the mayor's widow, and head of the Preservation Society, Mr. Halbert Rain, a quiet solicitor, and Dr. Isla Fenwick, the local physician. All had reason to be displeased with Lord Everdale's recent decisions, particularly Judith, who had once fought him in court over a churchyard boundary. Grange frowned. He didn't like it. The body placement felt too theatrical. "Send for Dr. Fenwick to examine the corpse," he said. "We'll need her assessment before we disturb the scene." But Dr. Fenwick, a no-nonsense woman with rolled sleeves and sharp spectacles, offered little clarity. "He's been dead for at least 6 hours," she announced. "Stabbed at the base of the skull. Precision but brutal. Death would have been immediate." "No signs he was moved?" "None. Blood suggests he died right here." "In the middle of a locked fairground?" She only raised her eyebrows. An hour later, as the body was carefully removed and the scene photographed, the atmosphere grew heavier. Villagers began gathering at the periphery, whispers, shocked gasps, and nervous glances. It was then, at precisely 10:34 a.m., that a small, dapper figure appeared on the gravel path leading to the gates. Immaculately dressed in a grey suit, his moustache perfectly waxed, he carried himself with a meticulous grace, stopping briefly to remove a speck from his lapel. Chief Inspector Grange blinked in surprise. "Monsieur Poirot?" "Ah, bonjour, mon ami," said Hercule Poirot with a slight bow. "I read of your fair in the Times. Imagine my fortune to arrive in time for such a curious development." Grange scowled. "You're on holiday?" "Mais oui. And you know how restful I find murder?" Poirot's eyes had already taken in the scene. The carousel, the body's former position, the blood, the faces in the crowd. "So dramatic," he said softly. "So very deliberate." Grange crossed his arms. "If you've come to solve it, you'd best begin with the committee. They were the last to see Everdale, and every one of them had a reason to wish him ill." Poirot smiled thinly, as if the game had already begun. "Excellent," he said. "Let us meet them. And then we shall see which of these painted smiles conceals the frown of guilt." Chapter 2. The First Clues Beneath the Gilded Saddle. The carousel creaked faintly as the wind nudged it into a sluggish spin, its faded music box melodies now a ghostly echo in the background. Poirot stood in stillness before the painted horse, the one now forever linked to death. Its mane was once white, now rusted red near the neck, the glossy enamel dulled by the violence it had witnessed. The saddle's ornate edges bore smudges as though fingers, dying perhaps, had clawed at it. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "A curious stage, is it not, for a man to die upon?" Grange sighed, arms crossed. "That's what's bothering me. The whole thing looks like a theatre set. Overly arranged, clean. Oui, and murder, mon ami, is rarely tidy unless it is performed with intention. We must not only ask how the victim came to die, but why here?" Poirot crouched, gingerly, never compromising the perfection of his trousers, and peered at the base of the carousel horse. His gloved fingers brushed lightly across the footrest. A tiny smear of black paint clung to the edge. "Fresh," he muttered. "Paint?" Grange leaned in. Poirot nodded. "Wet, still, just barely. From a boot, or perhaps a glove that had picked it up elsewhere. It is not blood, but it tells us something." Grange straightened, puzzled. "There's been no painting here recently." "No," said Poirot, rising. "But there may have been somewhere else. It is curious that the smear is on the underside of the stirrup, not visible to the eye, almost missed." They moved slowly around the carousel. Poirot was deliberate, scanning each detail, pausing before each horse. Most were standard fare, brightly painted in festive colours, names etched in curling script on brass plaques, Princess Daisy Apollo, Sir Lancer. But one steed caught his eye, the twin to the death mount, save for a subtle difference. "Regardez," Poirot gestured. "The horse upon which Lord Everdale was found is labelled Gallant, but its twin, Valiant, has a different saddle, less ornate." "Their replacements," came the voice of Leonard Flinch, who had returned with a wrench clutched in hand. "Gallant got refurbished last season, repainted and retouched. Valiant's next." Poirot nodded. "You repair these horses yourself?" "Of course, sir. Every nut, gear and stripe. Been doing it for 30 years. "And were you here all night?" Flinch hesitated. I stayed till about 11. Then I went back to my caravan, locked the gate. It was quiet. Didn't hear a sound." "And you are certain no one could have entered?" "As certain as a man sleeping can be," Flinch muttered. "But the fairground's open land. The fence isn't much. A determined man wouldn't have trouble slipping through." Poirot turned away, but his eyes had caught something else. A half-smudged boot print, in the gravel near the Carousel's control box. It was fine, not deep, indicating the person who left it had not lingered long. He said nothing but marked its shape carefully with his cane tip. Then came the constables, carting over a wooden chest that had been found behind the Carousel tent. Its lid bore scuff marks and faded letters, MER, Carousel Maintenance Equipment, but the initials were not Flinch's. Inside, coiled neatly atop a velvet cloth, lay a long brass pole, a tool for detaching carousel horses from their bases. Beside it, oddly out of place, was a child's silk ribbon, deep red, a shade too, elegant for a village fairground. Poirot picked it up gently. Mon Dieu, Grange frowned. A child's? Perhaps, but is silk this fine? Poirot turned it over. And here, look, the scent. He offered the ribbon to Grange, who gave a reluctant sniff. Perfume. Not cheap either. Poirot's eyes narrowed. So someone perfumed left this here, hidden among tools, and we must ask, why would a woman, or man, wearing high-end fragrance, be anywhere near such a chest? Grange scratched his chin. Could have been planted. Or dropped in haste. Poirot folded the ribbon. Either way, it adds intrigue, especially when paired with your victim's hands. Grange blinked. What about them? Did you not notice? Poirot asked. The fingertips, mon ami, calloused, but faintly stained with ink. Lord Everdale was writing something. Poirot turned on his heel, eyes alight now. We must search his pockets. The constable brought over the linen jacket, blood-spattered and stiff. Inside the left breast pocket was a folded sheet of thick stationery, Everdale's personal letterhead. The paper was damp around the edges, but legible. Poirot unfolded it. To whom it may concern, he read aloud, if anything should happen to me before the gala, please look into the matter of the Carousel. There is something not right. Grange exhaled hard. So, he suspected something. And feared it enough to write this, Poirot murmured. He was not merely killed. He was silenced. The two men stood in thought as the village bell rang 10 times in the distance. Poirot slipped the letter into an envelope and handed it to Grange. We must speak to those at the committee meeting, those who last saw him alive. Grange agreed. The rectory. Noon. I'll call them in. Poirot stepped back once more to view the painted horse, its gleaming eye now catching the morning light like a cruel wink. He adjusted his cufflinks with precision. A painted steed, a dead man with secrets, and a silk ribbon perfumed with lies, he said softly. The fair has come to town, yes, but it is not only the rides that go in circles, eh? Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. The rectory hall of Marbury-on-Avon, with its high oak beams and faded tapestries of medieval saints, was an unlikely venue for murder's echoes. Yet as the grandfather clock struck noon, the assembled guests bore expressions not unlike those attending a funeral service, anxious, dressed in haste, and each unwilling to make the first move. Poirot entered with Chief Inspector Grange, his gloved hands clasped neatly behind his back, scanning the room as one might scan a chessboard. 5 figures had been summoned, the key members of the Marbury Spring Fair Committee, each with ties, some deep, some tangled, to the late Lord Everdale. Messieurs, dames, Poirot greeted, bowing slightly. Thank you for coming. This is not, alas, the festive occasion you had hoped for, but perhaps it is still one of importance. Judith Langridge, regal even in her widow's weeds, sat upright at the end of the long table. Her eyes, sharp behind pearl-framed spectacles, moved from Poirot to Grange with suspicion. Are we suspects now, Inspector? Everyone is, until we know otherwise, said Grange, without malice. Beside her sat Dr. Isla Fenwick, sleeves rolled, expression clinical. She tapped her pen absently against her notepad, already observing everyone else. Halbert Rain, the solicitor, hunched over his hands. His spectacles slid down his nose, and his thin mouth twitched as if halfway through a thought he didn't dare voice. Next was Celia Burnham, still pale from the morning's discovery. Her voice had not yet recovered from the scream that summoned the village to horror. And lastly, leaning casually against the bookcase with an air of theatrical detachment, was Felix Hargrove, the fair's financial sponsor and heir to a minor viscountcy. His suit was immaculate, his smile bored, and his interest in the proceedings, at least on the surface, minimal. Poirot clasped his hands together. Each of you was present yesterday at the meeting where Lord Everdale voiced his plans to modernize Burnley Grange, a plan which, I understand, was not met with universal joy. A ripple passed through the room. Judith's chin lifted. If you're suggesting I would resort to murder over zoning rights, Monsieur Poirot, you underestimate my faith in the judiciary. Poirot inclined his head. But surely, madame, you must acknowledge that the plan threatened to tear away a part of Marbury's history, something you have dedicated your life to preserving? Yes, she said, steel in her tone. Charles Everdale didn't care about history, he only saw what he could sell, and he knew I couldn't stop him, legally at least. But murder, number I fight with petitions, not knives. Poirot turned. And you, Mr. Rain, did you support Lord Everdale's plans? The solicitor looked up, blinking. I advised him. That was my role. Whether I agreed or not was irrelevant. But surely you had opinions, Poirot pressed. Rain swallowed. His plans were aggressive, ill-considered perhaps. But legal, Dr. Fenwick interjected. He was reckless, yes. But he also enjoyed causing discomfort. He liked being the centre of discontent. It gave him something to push against. Poirot regarded her. And yet, Doctor, you have no shortage of strong opinions yourself. Did you argue with him? Isla Fenwick folded her arms. I told him he was making enemies faster than he could count them, and that one day someone would shove back. That's not a threat. It's a medical observation. Poirot raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Felix Hargrove, polishing a silver pen, finally spoke. Charles had a way of attracting drama, didn't he? I found it tiresome, which is why I stayed out of it. You didn't voice opposition? Poirot asked. Felix shrugged. No need. The deal wouldn't have gone through without my investment, and I hadn't signed the final papers. I rather enjoyed letting him squirm. Poirot's gaze lingered. So you had leverage over him? More than a little, Hargrove said with a smirk. He needed me, and I enjoyed watching him pretend he didn't. Poirot made a soft sound of interest and turned to Celia, who had remained silent. Mademoiselle Burnham, he said gently, you discovered the body. But you also knew Lord Everdale personally, did you not? She nodded, voice tight. He was a friend of my father's. I knew him since childhood, but lately he had changed, cold, aggressive. You argued with him. I tried to reason with him, told him the village wouldn't forgive him if he destroyed Burnley Grange. He laughed, said they'd forget once the profits rolled in. Poirot nodded slowly. Merci, he said to them all. You have each painted a portrait of a man both necessary and resented. It is a difficult truth. When a man like Lord Everdale dies, many grieve him, but others exhale. He turned to Grange. I would like access to the minutes of yesterday's committee meeting, if they were recorded. Judith nodded crisply. They're with the secretary, Mrs. Renfield. I'll send it to them. Très bien. As the meeting concluded, Poirot lingered near the window, gazing out at the greening hills and the distant spires of Marbury. Behind him, the suspects filtered out. some in silence, others in whispers. Grange joined him. "Do you get anything from that lot?" Poirot tilted his head. Everyone said what they wished to be heard, but none said what they felt. None. The truth is yet behind a curtain. He tapped the window glass once. "And I suspect," he added softly, "it is painted as prettily as the horse upon which our victim was laid to rest." Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. The sun had climbed a little higher by the time Hercule Poirot returned to the Carousel. The crowds had thinned, but the scent of anxiety still clung to the air. Constable Fay nodded deferentially as Poirot passed the perimeter tape and surveyed the scene once more, this time not merely as a witness to crime, but as a performer stepping onto his stage. He took in the Carousel's polished brass poles, the chipped enamel on the mirrored canopy, and the rows of garishly grinning horses. They had lost their innocence now. The place was no longer a fairground. It was a theatre of death. Poirot's fingers danced lightly over the saddle where Lord Everdale had been found. His gaze was sharp but serene. He was not looking for blood or footprints. He was looking for logic and for fear. Behind him, Chief Inspector Grange approached, a fresh notebook in hand. "I've spoken to the village solicitor and the doctor again. They all agree the victim made enemies. The whole committee had motive." Poirot nodded without turning. "Yes, but motive, mon ami, is only one star in the sky. We must chart the entire constellation." He straightened and turned to face Grange fully. "Have you determined how Lord Everdale entered the fairground?" "No," Grange admitted. "No signs of forced entry. The front gate was locked. No boot prints in the dew-covered grass apart from the ones we already noted. It's as if he appeared." Poirot pursed his lips. "And yet we know he did not fly." A moment passed before Poirot strolled over to the operator's booth, a small wooden structure with brass dials and a dusty window. He opened the door gently and stepped inside. The interior was cramped, littered with ticket stubs and a biscuit tin. But on the control panel lay something odd, a strand of green ribbon, neatly tied and hanging from a brass lever. Poirot called for Grange. "Another ribbon," he said, "but not silk and not red." Grange examined it. "This one's cheaper, carnival type. Looks like it came from a child's bonnet or a booth prize." "Or perhaps," Poirot said softly, "a disguise?" Grange's brow furrowed. "You think someone dressed up?" "I think someone wished not to be recognized. Whether that was by using darkness, distraction, or costume, we do not yet know, but someone took great care to stage a murder on a children's ride in a closed location at a time when it would cause the greatest impact." Poirot exited the booth and stared again at the horses. "This one," he said, pointing to Gallant, "was freshly painted last season, yes?" "Refinished under Flinch's own hand. That means the surface would be pristine." Grange nodded. "So?" Poirot tapped the saddle. "And yet here, near the rear buckle, there are faint scratches. Not from a child's shoe, from something sharper, something perhaps metallic." Grange leaned closer. "A weapon, or the means by which a body was placed upon it." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Do you see the effort? This was not murder in haste. This was murder in portraiture." As they returned toward the fairground entrance, a figure approached them on the gravel path. Mrs. Renfield, secretary of the village committee, clutching a manila folder to her chest. "I was told you wanted the meeting minutes, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, slightly breathless. "Oui, madame," Poirot said kindly, accepting the folder. "Merci beaucoup." She hesitated, then added in a quieter voice, "He said something strange just before the meeting ended yesterday." "Lord Everdale?" She nodded. "He said Enjoy the fair while it lasts. It will be the last one this village ever sees under your care. Poirot arched his brow. A threat? Perhaps, but it sounded more like victory. As she left, Poirot turned to Grange. It seems Lord Everdale fancied himself the architect of final acts, but the stage collapsed on him before the curtain rose. Grange gave a humourless chuckle. All right, Poirot, where do we start? Poirot gave a thin smile. We begin not with the murderer, he said, but with their audience. He opened the folder and scanned the minutes, timestamps, topic points, procedural notes. One stood out. Meeting adjourned 8:43 p.m. Curious, he murmured. I am told the meeting ran late, and yet this says it ended early. He handed it to Grange. We must verify the time, for in murder, minutes, no, seconds, can hide a lifetime of lies. As they made their way back to the inn where Poirot was staying, the painted carousel behind them stood still once more. But to Hercule Poirot it was still spinning, only now the horses wore faces, and each suspect rode their secrets in a perfect, gilded circle. Chapter 5. The First Interviews. Begin by mid-afternoon, the drawing-room of the Marbury Arms Inn had been converted into a temporary interview space. Grange had commandeered the writing desk in the corner, while Poirot, ever precise, had arranged two high-backed chairs directly across from one another, so that nothing could obscure his view of a suspect's eyes. A single vase of daffodils stood on the table between them. Poirot did not remove it. Beauty, he had said, has its place, even in inquiry. The first to arrive was Celia Burnham. She entered nervously, hands clasped before her. Poirot gestured gently toward the chair. Mademoiselle, he said, you have been through much already today. I ask only that you speak with honesty and care. Celia nodded, eyes downcast. Have you known Lord Everdale since childhood? Yes, she said. He was often at our house. My father helped manage the estate. After he passed, Lord Everdale kept in touch, but the man who came back from the continent was not the man I knew. In what way, mademoiselle? He was harder, as though something had soured in him. He'd always been proud, but now he seemed cruel. Cruel? He mocked people, their ambitions, their fears. At the last committee meeting, he told Mrs. Langridge that preserving the past was like keeping bones in your living room. Said it with a laugh. She turned red. Poirot folded his hands. You confronted him, non? Celia nodded reluctantly. Yes. I begged him to reconsider the development plan. He only smiled and said, You'd be surprised what secrets the Grange is hiding. Perhaps it's best the past be bulldozed. Poirot glanced at Grange, then back at Celia. Did you understand what he meant? No, she said, a tremor in her voice. But he looked so satisfied, as if he'd already won. Thank you, mademoiselle, Poirot said gently. You may go. Next came Dr. Isla Fenwick. She entered briskly, her expression unreadable. She did not sit until invited, and even then she perched on the edge of the chair as though ready to leap up at any moment. Doctor, Poirot began, you examined the body at the scene. Your impressions? Fenwick crossed her arms. Single stab wound, precise. Base of the skull, angled upward, suggests the killer knew anatomy. You believe it was premeditated? Undoubtedly. No signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds. He was taken unaware. Would you say the killer had medical knowledge? Fenwick raised an eyebrow. That, or blind luck, but I would lean toward the former. Poirot steepled his fingers. And what of Lord Everdale's mental state? Did you see signs of paranoia, fear? Fenwick paused. He came to me a week ago, said he'd been having nightmares, asked for a sedative. I gave him one, low dose. He didn't elaborate. But you sensed something? He seemed preoccupied, as if carrying more than he could say. I assumed it was the stress of the committee backlash. Poirot tilted his head. Did he mention the carousel? Fenwick's gaze flickered. Number Y? Because he left a note implying something was amiss there. She exhaled. I hadn't heard that. Poirot gave a small nod. Thank you, Doctor. You've been most helpful. As she departed, Grange muttered, So now we know he was frightened. That puts motive back on the table. Not just for his enemies, but for those he may have threatened. Precisely, Poirot said. He who fears is often feared. Halbert Rain arrived next, his suit crumpled, and his spectacles fogged slightly from the spring damp. He sat cautiously, adjusting his cuffs with nervous fingers. You were Lord Everdale's solicitor? Poirot asked. I handled his domestic legal affairs, Rain replied. He had outside counsel for international holdings. You advised him regarding the Burnley Grange development? I did, though reluctantly. Reluctantly, Poirot echoed. Rain hesitated. I grew up in this village, Monsieur Poirot. I understand what Burnley Grange means to people, but Lord Everdale had rights. My job was to inform him of them. Poirot nodded. Did he speak of opposition? Did he name individuals he suspected might try to stop him? Rain gave a thin smile. He wasn't afraid of opposition. He welcomed it. He said it made victory sweeter. A man of provocation, then. Oh, yes. He liked playing people against each other. Said it kept things interesting. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And did he ever mention secrets? Anything buried? Rain's smile faltered. He mentioned something once. Said the Grange had skeletons. Figurative ones, I assumed. You assumed, Poirot repeated softly. But did you ask? Number with Everdale, it was wiser not to pry. When Rain left, Poirot walked slowly to the window. Outside, the fairground gleamed faintly in the afternoon light, the carousel still cloaked in police tape. 3 interviews, he said quietly. 3 perspectives, and yet no one speaks of the hour between the meeting's end and the presumed time of death. Grange frowned. You think they're hiding something? I think they are dodging something, Poirot said. A detail, a presence, a word perhaps said in anger or fear, something none dare admit, yet. He turned from the window. But we will uncover it, mon ami, for lies, like paint, may hide the truth for a time, but eventually the colour cracks. Chapter 6. The First False Lead. The next morning dawned with a hush. Grey clouds hung low over Marbury-on-Avon, draping the village in a dull, oppressive light. Poirot sipped his chocolate shawl slowly in the inn's dining room, his napkin folded precisely across his lap, when Constable Fay burst in, red-faced and breathless. Inspector Grange sent me, the young man blurted. There's been a development. He needs you at the constabulary at once. Poirot stood, placing his cup on the saucer with surgical precision. Lead the way, mon ami, but calmly. A case unravelled in haste is often tied in knots. Minutes later, Poirot entered the modest brick police station, where Grange was already pacing before a narrow holding cell. Inside sat Leonard Flinch, the carousel operator, wringing his hat and muttering under his breath. "What is this, Chief Inspector?" Poirot asked, his tone even but wary. "We found something," Grange said grimly, handing Poirot a folded cloth, "hidden beneath Flinch's caravan floorboards." Poirot unwrapped it. Inside lay a slender blade, slightly curved, with an ivory handle and dried, rust-coloured flecks on the edge. "A stiletto," Grange said, "clean but for that dried stain. We'll confirm it's blood. but it matches the angle and depth of the wound in Everdale's neck. Poirot frowned. And the motive? Grange gestured toward the interview room. He claims he's being framed, but the man's struggling financially. He's been fined twice this year for equipment violations, and Everdale had plans to demolish part of the fairgrounds for access roads. That would have put Flinch out of business. Convenient motive, Poirot murmured. But the hiding place, it feels too convenient, no? They stepped into the interview room. Flinch looked up, eyes wide with misery. "I swear I didn't kill him," he cried. "I'd no reason to. The man was a snake, yes, but he was just noise. I never thought he'd go through with it." Poirot approached, his voice gentle. "Monsieur Flinch, let us start with the evening of the murder. What time did you retire to your caravan?" 11, as I said," Flinch replied. "I did my rounds, locked up the machinery, and went to bed." "And you saw no one? Heard no one?" "Nothing but wind and a loose tarpaulin flapping. If someone came in, they were quiet as cats." Poirot nodded. "And this knife, have you ever seen it before?" Flinch shook his head vigorously. "Never. I use tools, not toys like that." "Did you permit anyone near your tools recently?" "Only the fair crew, a few kids from the village who come to help with maintenance sometimes, but nothing serious. I lock everything up tight." Poirot leaned closer. "Monsieur Flinch, you may not be a murderer, but someone wants you to look like one." Grange folded his arms. "Still, it's hard to ignore the blade." Poirot gave a small shrug. "Hard, yes, but not impossible. Come, Chief Inspector, let us revisit the scene once more, with sharper eyes." Back at the fairgrounds, the clouds had thickened, and drizzle began to fleck the grass. Poirot, umbrella in hand, walked with calm deliberation toward the carousel, now cordoned off like a forbidden relic. Grange trailed behind. "You think the knife was planted?" "I think," Poirot said softly, "that murderers rarely hide evidence where it is sure to be found, unless they are fools or wish to implicate another." He paused near the chest of carousel tools. It had already been dusted for prints, but Poirot seemed interested in something else, the soil beneath. Kneeling carefully, he used a small wooden stick to prod the earth. Then he rose. "There," he said. "A heel mark, deeper than the rest, and angled." Grange squinted. "Could be Flinch's." "But it is the angle that interests me," Poirot replied. "Someone stood here not to repair, but to observe. Look, the line of sight leads straight to Flinch's caravan door." "You're saying the real killer watched him? Or waited for him to sleep, then planted the blade knowing the next morning would bring suspicion?" Grange scratched his head. "But who'd do such a thing?" Poirot turned his gaze back toward the village, his voice like silk. "That, my friend, is what we must discover. And we begin with the red ribbon." Grange blinked. "The one we found in the tool chest." "Oui, I asked for it to be tested, not only for trace materials, but also for scent." "Perfume, you recall?" Grange nodded slowly. "And?" Poirot smiled faintly. "The laboratory returned their report this morning. The ribbon bore a trace of étoile d'argent, a rare perfume produced in Paris, and I happen to know only one person in Marbury who orders it." Grange's eyes widened. "Judith Langridge." Poirot said nothing, but his silence was an answer. The painted horses behind them gleamed wetly in the drizzle. Once more the circle had turned, and Poirot, poised at its centre, saw that the game had only just begun. Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. The rain had retreated by mid-afternoon, leaving the cobblestones of Marbury gleaming under a sullen sky. Hercule Poirot walked with deliberate steps along the gravel path to Burnley Grange, a folded umbrella tucked neatly under one arm and his gloves still impeccably white. His mind was turning, not with suspicion, but with certainty. A game was being played. One of psychology, of theatre. And Poirot, ever the conductor of human contradictions, was ready to play his part. Judith Langridge greeted him at the great oak doors, her posture as straight as the iron fencing outside. "Monsieur Poirot," she said coolly, "have you come to question me further, or merely to admire the architecture Lord Everdale intended to destroy?" "Both, madam," Poirot replied with a small smile. "But primarily to understand a scent." She frowned. "A scent?" "Oui, a ribbon found near the scene bore a trace of étoile d'argent, a very fine perfume, Parisian, no longer easily obtained." Judith's expression did not falter. And I am told by the village chemist that only one person in Marbury regularly orders it." Judith's mouth tightened. "That would be me." "Indeed. Which raises the question, why did your perfume find itself amidst a chest of Carousel tools? Perhaps someone else owns the same fragrance." Poirot shook his head gently. "No, madame, the scent is distinct, and while imitation is possible, accidents are not. The ribbon bore your fragrance and was found within the very chest used to assemble the horse upon which Lord Everdale met his end." Judith turned from him, walking slowly toward the fireplace, where a small blaze crackled. She stared into it for a moment before speaking. "I did visit the fairground the night before he died," she said at last. "I couldn't sleep. I went for a walk and passed by. The lights were off. It was quiet." "Did you enter the grounds?" She hesitated. "Briefly, I wanted to see the Carousel. It was always Charles's favourite as a child." Poirot's brow arched. "You and he shared history?" "A complicated one. We were engaged once, long ago, before he inherited, before he discovered that wealth excused cruelty." "Ah," Poirot said softly. "So your resentment was personal as well as civic." Judith turned to face him, her eyes steely. "He was destroying everything this village stood for. He called it progress. I called it desecration." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And so, madame, you left your ribbon there, unintentionally perhaps?" "Perhaps," she replied. "Or perhaps someone saw me, followed me, used my presence as a lever." Poirot allowed silence to settle between them. The crackle of the fire and the soft tick of a mantel clock filled the space. "And tell me, Madame Langridge," he said at last, "do you recall the moment the committee meeting ended?" She blinked. "Yes, just before 9. Why?" "The minutes recorded it at precisely 8:43 p.m., yet the secretary insists it went later." Judith's eyes narrowed. "What are you implying?" "That someone adjusted the record," Poirot replied, "to create a false alibi." Judith stepped forward. "And you believe that person to be me?" "I believe," Poirot said gently, "that you are afraid, not of being guilty, but of being suspected. And such fear makes one hide truths that could, in fact, exonerate them." She hesitated. "I left early, before the meeting ended. I didn't want to argue again. Charles was goading everyone. I took my leave without telling Mrs. Renfield." Poirot gave a slow nod. "That is something you should have said before." Judith sat heavily in an armchair. "He told me that night. You will see, Judith. Even the past can be erased. You just need the right brush." It chilled me. Poirot paused, then spoke more quietly. "What else did he say?" Judith's voice lowered. "He said that something hidden in the Granger's foundations would change the village's story forever. I thought it was another of his dramatic boasts." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "A secret buried," he murmured. "Quite literally." He stood, brushing a non-existent speck from his sleeve. "Merci, madame. You have given me much to consider." As he made his way out of Burnley Grange, the drizzle began anew. But Poirot did not open his umbrella. His mind was a whirl with pieces, a ribbon, a forged meeting time, a whispered threat, and now a buried secret. Grange met him at the inn later that evening. "Well?" the inspector asked. "She admits to planting the knife?" "No," Poirot said, "because she did not." Grange's brow furrowed. "Then who did?" Poirot stared out the window, where the Carousel sat cloaked in twilight. "The one who is watching us all," he said softly. "The one who lays clues as carefully as a painter applies colour, one stroke at a time. And somewhere, behind one of those painted smiles, a murderer was waiting for their final portrait to dry." Chapter 8. A secondary mystery. The morning mist curled low across the village green like breath on cold glass, muting the early chatter of Marbury-on-Avon. Poirot stood outside the churchyard gate, his eyes fixed not on the chapel itself, but on the shadows cast by the grange beyond. The house loomed, ancient, dignified, and now oddly secretive. Something was buried there in more ways than one. A young boy came pelting down the road, cheeks red with urgency. "Monsieur Poirot, sir, Inspector Grange said to fetch you. There's been something's gone missing." Poirot inclined his head. "Lead the way, mon petit général." The boy turned and ran, and Poirot followed at a brisk pace, arriving minutes later at the village hall, where a pale-faced Mrs. Renfield met him with wringing hands and a quiver in her voice. "It's the minutes!" she gasped. "The committee meeting record, the original handwritten ledger, it's gone." Grange, already on site, waved Poirot over to the hall office, where the secretary's cabinet now stood ajar. A faint scent of lavender drifted from the papers within. The ledger, once kept on the top shelf, had vanished. Poirot examined the interior with careful precision. "No forced entry?" "None," Grange replied. "The window was open, but the latch wasn't broken. Could have been a key, or someone who knew the building," Poirot finished. He tapped his chin. "Who had access to this room last?" "Only Mrs. Renfield and the committee, I suppose." Poirot nodded slowly. "So someone removed the official record to conceal the actual meeting timeline." Mrs. Renfield looked aghast. "But why?" "To strengthen an alibi," Poirot said softly, "or to erase one." He stepped into the hall's main chamber, pausing beneath the high beams where faded bunting still fluttered from the last spring gala. His eyes swept over the gallery of committee portraits lining the back wall, 10 framed photos, each solemn and formal. Lord Everdale's frame stood empty, the photograph removed. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Where is his portrait?" Mrs. Renfield blinked. "It was there yesterday, I swear it." Grange cursed under his breath. "Now who'd want to take that?" Poirot didn't answer immediately. He moved closer to the wall where the portrait had hung. A faint rectangular shadow remained, the edges of the wallpaper less faded beneath the frame. "Not the photograph that matters," he murmured, "but perhaps what was on it." Grange frowned. "You think there was a note? Or a message?" "Or an inconsistency," Poirot said. "Something someone did not wish us to notice. We must locate the photograph. It may be more valuable than it appears." Just then a voice called from the foyer. "Monsieur Poirot?" It was Felix Hargrove, dressed in riding attire, boots polished, gloves tucked under one arm. Poirot turned. "Monsieur Hargrove, how good of you to join us." "I heard about the missing document," Felix said, eyes cool, "and thought I might help. I have a copy of the meeting summary in my own notes. Typed, of course. I always prepare my own version, a habit from the city." Poirot accepted the offered pages with a grateful nod. "Merci, monsieur. You are the most diligent." Felix smiled thinly. "I like precision." Poirot scanned the summary. The meeting end time was listed as 9:21 p.m., not 8:43, as the official version had claimed. Curious, Poirot mused. Felix shrugged. I'd say sloppy secretarial work, though I admit, Lord Everdale was in rare form that night. Insulted just about everyone. Judith, Dr. Fenwick, even young Celia, called her a frightened little robin who should stick to organizing bake sales. Poirot did not react outwardly, but something in his eyes glinted. Did Celia respond? He asked. She turned crimson and left the room, very dramatic. And when did you leave? Felix hesitated. Shortly after her. 10 minutes, perhaps. The air was getting thick. Poirot tucked the notes into his pocket. You have been most helpful. Felix nodded, curtly. If you'll excuse me, I've got a horse waiting. As Felix exited, Poirot turned to Grange. You see, mon ami, the timeline shifts again, and always in small, quiet ways. First, the ledger is altered, then it disappears, and now a portrait vanishes into thin air. Grange rubbed his temple. You think someone's cleaning up the past? Poirot tilted his head. I think someone is rewriting it. And what about Hargrove? Grange asked. You trust his summary? I trust that it was typed, Poirot said, and that it was delivered at precisely the moment we needed it to be. He walked to the window, staring out at the Grange in the distance, its windows shuttered, its secrets locked behind red brick and inherited privilege. And so the second mystery emerges, Poirot said. Not one of blood, but of ink, of truth turned into shadow. Grange looked over. And the person who took the photograph? Poirot's eyes narrowed. They know we are getting close, which means, at last, they are growing afraid. The carousel, far in the background, stood still beneath the grey. But somewhere the gears had begun to turn again. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The wind whispered through Marbury's narrow lanes that evening, tugging at curtains and rustling hedgerows with secrets. Poirot stood before the fireplace in his suite at the Marbury Arms, the typed meeting summary in one hand and a photograph in the other. A copy of the missing portrait that Grange had wisely ordered duplicated months earlier. He studied the image of Lord Everdale, seated stiffly at the centre of the village committee, his expression taut with impatience. But it was not Everdale that held Poirot's attention. It was the arrangement of the chairs, the glances between the committee members, the casual positioning of hands and shoulders that, when viewed carefully, told an entirely different story. Grange arrived moments later, trenchcoat dusted with rain. We've checked every building on the Grange property, no sign of the original portrait. Whoever took it didn't just hide it, they destroyed it. Poirot nodded. That would suggest the photograph revealed something dangerous, not to the public, but to one person in particular. Grange sank into the armchair. You think the killer's one of them? Poirot gave him a flat look. I think the killer is all of them, in one way or another. But only one hand wielded the blade. Let us begin with the links no one speaks of. He handed the photograph to Grange and tapped it with a gloved finger. Look at the placement. Lord Everdale is in the centre, as chairman. But see how close Dr. Fenwick sits to Felix Hargrove. Look at her lean. Her arm is practically touching his sleeve. Grange frowned. Could just be coincidence? Perhaps. But now let us consider this, Doctor. Fenwick's practice is heavily subsidized by a private donor. A donor who insisted on anonymity until this morning, when I asked the bank for the name of the account. Grange sat up straighter. You're serious? Poirot nodded. Felix Hargrove. He has been quietly funding her clinic for nearly 2 years. Grange rubbed his jaw. Now that's something. Why would he hide that? Because they have a connection neither wishes to be made public. Intimacy, blackmail, or perhaps a mutual investment in the development plans. We do not yet know. But it binds them. Poirot moved to the desk and spread out copies of the meeting minutes, typed and handwritten. Now let us turn to Halbert Rain. He presented himself as an unwilling legal servant to Lord Everdale. Oui? Yes. And yet, Poirot said, holding up a bank record, he received a payment 3 days before the murder. A payment from an account tied not to Everdale, but to a real estate holding company in London. Grange's eyes narrowed. Whose? Also Felix Hargrove's. Grange stood. So Hargrove was buying loyalty. Or silence, Poirot said. Rain may have drawn up more than land deeds. He may have known about something buried, something Lord Everdale was preparing to reveal. A will, Grange guessed, or a deed, or a confession, something with the power to upend reputations. Grange leaned against the windowsill, exhaling. And the secretary, Mrs. Renfield? She is not innocent, Poirot said, but her vice is protection, not ambition. She altered the meeting minutes, oui, but she did not do so for herself. For whom, then? Poirot's gaze drifted to the carousel visible from the window. For Celia Burnham. Grange turned, startled. The girl who found the body? Precisely. A shy woman, polite to a fault, and yet Lord Everdale called her a frightened robin. In front of the others, he humiliated her. Why? Grange shrugged. Maybe just to be cruel. Non, Poirot said. He was afraid of her, of something she had said or done, perhaps even something she knew. He walked slowly back to the table, where the red ribbon lay beside the meeting notes. She left the meeting early, humiliated, but was she seen again that night? Not one witness places her at home during the critical window. Grange looked troubled. You think she could have done it? Poirot raised a finger. Murder? No. But she knows more than she's let on, perhaps even witnessed something. And that fear of being implicated has silenced her. The room fell still. Then Poirot said, One final thread. He retrieved a folded letter from his coat. Lord Everdale was preparing to announce something at the gala. A sealed letter was found in his study, addressed to the Marbury Historical Society. Grange stepped forward. What does it say? Poirot unfolded it carefully. I have reason to believe that documents stored within Burnley Grange confirm a suppressed connection between the Langridge family and the original sale of the fairground land. If proven, this renders the committee's governance of the site illegal and all subsequent transactions void. I intend to disclose this at the gala. C.E. Grange whistled. So that's the secret. The Langridge family never had the right to manage the fairground. If that got out, the committee's power would dissolve overnight, Poirot finished. Judith Langridge had the most to lose, Grange said quietly. Oui, and perhaps the most pride to preserve. Poirot stared again at the photograph, 5 faces frozen in ceremony. But now the symmetry was broken, a portrait removed, a secret buried, and every bond between the suspects unravels thread by thread. The web was closing, but the spider, silent, patient, had not yet shown its face. Poirot folded his arms. Tomorrow, he said, we shake the carousel and see who falls off. Chapter 10. Poirot's Secret Clue. The next morning broke with a crystalline chill. The spring rain had lifted, leaving the streets of Marbury-on-Avon washed clean but hollow, as though the village itself held its breath. In his room at the Marbury Arms, Poirot stood before his open suitcase, methodically polishing a pair of patent leather shoes, not because they required shining, but because the act, deliberate, rhythmic, focused the mind. He had seen it the day before, buried not in conversation, but in the glint of metal and a scrap of fibrous material lodged in a carousel groove. While Grange had paced, while suspects had lied, Poirot had been listening, not to words, but to silence, and silence had spoken. He tucked the polished shoes into his suitcase, closed the lid, and walked to the desk. From a folded slip of paper he retrieved the item, a fragment no longer than his thumbnail, barely visible. It was dark, stiff, almost like coarse black thread. But it wasn't a thread, it was horsehair, synthetic, burnt at the end from a wig. He slipped the fragment into an envelope and sealed it without a word. When he joined Chief Inspector Grange in the constabulary's back room, an hour later the inspector was mid-yawn and elbow-deep in statements. "I've gone through everything we have on Flinch again," Grange muttered. "Nothing suggests he knew about the Grange land deeds." Poirot nodded, distracted. "It is no longer Flinch who concerns me." Grange paused. "Then who?" Poirot turned and opened a folder on the desk. Inside were photographs of the carousel, taken from every angle. The bloodied horse, the control box, the crowd barrier. But Poirot pointed to a less dramatic image, one taken from a distance, where the ride appeared whole and untouched. "There," he said. "Do you see it?" Grange leaned in. "The horse?" "Number the shadow." Indeed, on the right edge of the frame was the faint outline of a figure, mid-step, blurred, barely visible through the canvas of the operator's tent. "Time stamped at 4:12 a.m., Poirot said, "before Celia found the body. Too early for staff, too late for revelry." Grange's brow furrowed. Could that be the killer? "Or someone returning to the scene," Poirot replied, "to adjust something, perhaps the position of the body, or to retrieve what they left behind." He reached into his pocket and retrieved the small envelope. "I found this wedged between the carousel base and the wooden platform," he said. "A fragment of a black wig, synthetic horsehair, singed as though cut or burned quickly, and not naturally shed." Grange took it, holding it up to the light. "Why a wig?" Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Because someone wore a disguise that night, a costume, to move unseen or to appear as someone else. Someone like a performer, a vendor, or perhaps even a child. With the fairground dark and deserted, the right outfit would render you invisible. Who would question a clown at a carousel, a painted lady in the night?" Grange set the fragment down. "So, it's all theatre." "As I said before," Poirot said, "this murder was staged, meticulously, theatrically. The killer did not merely wish to remove Lord Everdale, they wanted the act to say something." Grange nodded slowly. "Then we're not looking for rage, we're looking for composition, someone with flair." "Oui," Poirot said, "and control." He reached into the folder again and removed a copy of the old village gala programs, historical pamphlets from past years. Each one included a list of event organizers, volunteers, and performers. Poirot flipped to last year's. "Look here," he said, pointing. "Theatrical entertainment, costume tableau, directed and staged by—" Celia Burnham Grange blinked. "She never mentioned that." "No," Poirot said softly, "but it explains a great deal. Her eye for staging, her comfort with props and disguise, and most of all, her silence. You think she did it?" Poirot didn't answer immediately. "I think," he said at last, "that she knows who did. Perhaps she helped them. Perhaps she tried to stop them, but she knows more than she's admitted." Grange stood. "So what do we do?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "We make her talk." He gathered the photos, the letter, and the wig fragment, and slid them into his valise. Then he turned and gave a short nod. "But not with force. Non, No, with precision. We do not break the cage, we open it. As they exited the station, the sun had begun to pierce the clouds, casting long rays over the Grange and the distant fairground. But Poirot saw only shadows, because behind the daffodils and the bunting, behind the polite tea trays and the hand-sewn ribbons, the killer was watching, and the final act was about to begin. Chapter 11. Tensions rise by midday. The atmosphere in Marbury-on-Avon had shifted palpably. The church bell tolled for a wedding rehearsal no one was paying attention to, and the fairground, though slated to reopen for the spring gala that evening, remained under police tape and scrutiny. Word had spread that Poirot had discovered a disguise. Whispers of wigs and shadows fluttered like bunting along the village lanes. Inside the rectory's reading room, Grange had gathered the principal committee members, Celia Burnham, Felix Hargrove, Judith Langridge, Halbert Rain, and Dr. Isla Fenwick, under the guise of needing additional clarifications. But it was no casual conversation. Poirot stood by the fireplace, arms crossed behind his back, watching the players gather around the table. Grange opened brusquely. "We've had developments in the investigation. More than one of you has withheld information." No one spoke. Poirot's eyes glided across them, Celia looking down, hands fidgeting, Judith perched like a statue, lips thin. Felix leaned back in a calculated display of nonchalance. Rain adjusted his cuffs, glancing sidelong at the others, and Isla Fenwick, her gaze was fixed, almost expectant. "Someone," Grange said, "removed the original meeting ledger from the village hall." Judith raised her chin. "And you suspect one of us?" Poirot answered instead. "Madame Langridge, you once told me you believe in preservation, of truth, of history. And yet what is history, if not the honest recording of moments past?" She narrowed her eyes. "I didn't take it." "No," Poirot said, "but perhaps you benefited from its absence." A shift of discomfort ran through the group. Poirot let silence hang. Then he turned to Felix Hargrove. "You, monsieur, were kind enough to provide a typed meeting summary, a useful gesture, but why record the precise moment Celia Burnham left if it held no relevance?" Felix smirked. "I have a tidy mind." "But not a transparent one," Poirot said sharply. "You left shortly after Celia, so you claim, but witnesses place you returning to the fairground later that night." Felix blinked. "I did no such thing." Poirot lifted a photograph, an image from the Carousel surveillance stills. "Unclear, perhaps. But this figure," he tapped the silhouette on the edge of the frame, "wears riding boots, just like the pair you wore yesterday. A subtle detail, but a telling one. The gait matches your frame." Felix laughed dryly. "This is absurd." Poirot stepped closer. "Is it? You own the land development firm poised to profit the most from Everdale's removal. You were the last to sign off on the deal. Without your signature, the development was stalled. Lord Everdale's death cleared the way." Across the room, Judith turned toward Felix, her voice like frost. "You said you hadn't made a decision." Felix's facade slipped momentarily. "I hadn't, but I was close." Poirot interjected, "Close enough to fear what Everdale was about to reveal." Felix's fists clenched. He was going to ruin me over technicality. "No," Poirot said gently, "over the truth. He had discovered your connection to the original fairground purchase, that you and Judith Langridge's grandfather had manipulated the deed to ensure your family's continued control." Judith stood abruptly. "That is a lie." "It is in the letter," Poirot said. "Everdale left it for the Historical Society. He planned to present it at the gala, but someone ensured that would never happen." Halbert Rain, until then silent, now spoke with a shaky voice. "I drew up the modern version of the deeds. I didn't know about the older ones." Poirot turned slowly. "But you took money from Felix Hargrove, did you not?" Rain paled. "It was for advisory work, nothing illegal." Poirot tilted his head. "Yet the timing was most convenient, days before the murder." Tension crackled in the room like distant thunder. Grange observed the suspects trading wary glances, alliances quietly fraying. The unity of the committee had splintered. What remained were individuals, each carrying their own self-interest, fear, and rapidly eroding confidence in one another. Then Poirot turned to the final person at the table. "Mademoiselle Burnham," he said gently, "you have said very little." Celia looked up, startled. "Tell me," he continued, "what did you see that night?" Her voice caught. I didn't see anything." "But you returned," Poirot said. "Not to the Grange, but to the fairground. You were seen passing the Baker's Lane just after midnight, alone." Celia's hands trembled. "I only went back to retrieve my scarf. I left it at the committee tent." "And yet," Poirot said softly, "you did not return home until nearly 2. A silence fell. Felix stood suddenly. "This is a waste of time. If you have proof, present it. If not, stop dragging our names through the mud." Poirot didn't flinch. "Oh, I will present it. Soon, but not yet." He stepped back from the firelight, letting the room fall into hush once more. "The killer is not unknown to you," he said. "They have walked among you, smiled beside you, and watched you panic. But their greatest weapon is your silence." With that, Poirot turned and departed the room, the door clicking softly behind him. Inside, the remaining suspects sat in wary silence, once a committee, now a room full of threats, unspoken grievances and unravelling lies. Outside, the carousel gleamed in the fading light, still locked, but no longer still. The gears of truth were grinding into motion, and soon someone would be caught in their teeth. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. The storm finally broke at dusk. Rain fell in needles against the stone paths of Marbury-on-Avon, drumming on windows and beating down the last blossoms of the early spring tulips. Inside the small vestry behind the church, Hercule Poirot stood perfectly dry, a silk handkerchief in his hand and a thoughtful gleam in his eyes. The village outside was wet and restless, rumours moving faster than the clouds. The gala had been postponed, the fair remained closed, and trust was vanishing like the colour from the sky. Poirot adjusted his tie with precision as Chief Inspector Grange entered, coat soaked, hair flattened by the downpour. "She's here," Grange muttered. "Bon," Poirot replied. "Bring her in, alone." Celia Burnham entered hesitantly, the door shutting behind her like a final punctuation mark. She was pale, soaked despite her umbrella, and carrying something wrapped in cloth. Poirot gestured toward the chair across from him. "Please, mademoiselle, sit." She did, shivering slightly. "I imagine you know why I have asked to see you again." Celia nodded slowly. "You think I'm hiding something?" Poirot's brow lifted. "Am I wrong?" Her lips parted, but no words came. Only the sound of the rain filled the silence. Poirot leaned forward. "I believe, mademoiselle, that you witnessed something the night Lord Everdale died. Something that frightened you. And rather than come forward, you tried to forget. But such things do not remain forgotten. They linger like damp beneath the floorboards." She swallowed. I didn't know what I saw. I still don't." Poirot was quiet for a beat. Then let us walk through it together." She looked at him, startled. "You returned to the fairground after the meeting," he said. "You said it was for your scarf." "Yes, that part's true." "And while there, You saw someone else? She nodded, voice trembling. I saw a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat and something on their head. At first, I thought it was a child's hat, but it was strange. The light caught it. It was glossy, like plastic or fake hair. A wig, Poirot said. She nodded. They were standing by the carousel. I ducked behind the ticket booth. I didn't want them to see me. I was frightened. And then? They disappeared. I waited maybe 10 minutes before daring to move. That's when I found the scar and saw Lord Everdale's body slumped over the horse. I couldn't scream. I just ran. Poirot's gaze softened. Why did you not tell anyone? I was afraid. I thought, if they saw me, they might come after me next. And I didn't want to believe what I saw. Poirot tapped his fingers lightly on the table. And what did you believe, mademoiselle? Celia reached into her coat and carefully unwrapped the cloth bundle. Inside was a cracked ceramic mask, crudely painted, part clown, part jester. Poirot's eyes flicked to it. Where did you find this? In the rubbish bins behind the green, 2 days ago. I recognized the paint. Judith uses that exact shade in her preservation workshops. I thought it was part of her old gala supplies, but now you wonder if it was used to disguise the killer, Poirot finished. Celia nodded. Grange, standing silently in the shadows until now, stepped forward. Why bring it to us now? Because... Celia hesitated. Because I also saw something else. On the inside of the mask, just a smudge, lipstick, deep red. I don't wear any. Judith does. Poirot leaned closer. You believe she was the one in disguise? I don't know, Celia whispered. But it was her shape, her stance. Something in the way she stood. It felt familiar. Poirot stood, taking the mask delicately, inspecting the inside. There, faint but unmistakable, a lipstick smear along the upper edge. He gave a satisfied nod. Merci, mademoiselle. You have done well. She stood too, uncertain. Do you think she did it? Poirot looked at her for a long moment. I think the truth, mademoiselle, is rarely so tidy, but you have helped me uncover something important, and soon all will be made clear. As Celia left the vestry, Grange turned to Poirot, his expression grim. If Judith was the one in disguise... Poirot tucked the mask into his valise. Then we must ask, was she the performer, or simply another part of the stagecraft? Grange raised a brow. You think someone else pulled the strings? Poirot gave a faint smile. Always. There is a hand behind the hand, mon ami, and I believe at last I can see its shadow. He looked out at the soaked village square where the carousel loomed in the distance like a forgotten music box. It is nearly time, he said. One last spin, and the music will stop. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape night returned to Marbury-on-Avon in flickers, gas lamps sputtering to life along the cobbled lanes, the carousel at the fairground lit in eerie hues of blue and gold, despite being cordoned off by thick police tape. The wind had calmed, but the village was restless. Behind shutters and drawn curtains, people whispered. The great reveal loomed, and though Poirot had not yet summoned the suspects, it was clear something was about to break. And indeed, something did. It began just after 10 o'clock. A sharp rap on Chief Inspector Grange's door at the Marbury Arms brought Poirot to his feet, his moustache immaculate despite the hour. Constable Fay stood panting in the hallway, his slicked hair now stuck to his forehead. "She's gone, sir." "Who?" Grange barked, already grabbing his coat. "Judith Langridge. Her housekeeper found her room empty. The car is missing." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "How long ago?" "She must have left after supper. Quiet. Took the back drive. No one saw her." Poirot turned to Grange. "She knows the net is closing, and now she runs." Grange growled. "She'll not get far. We'll block the road to Avonmouth and check the train station." "No," Poirot interrupted calmly. "She is not fleeing to vanish. She is fleeing to be destroyed." Grange stopped. "What do you mean?" Poirot reached for his coat. "There is some proof that she believes still exists, likely hidden in Burnley Grange. Documents, perhaps. A ledger, a second will. She does not intend to disappear. She intends to erase the last piece of Lord Everdale's legacy before it can be read aloud." Grange blinked. "Then we head there, now." They arrived at Burnley Grange 10 minutes later. The house loomed silent, its many windows aglow in moonlight. No smoke rose from the chimneys, but Poirot noted the faintest flicker inside the west wing. The library. They advanced without sirens, Grange, Poirot, and 2 constables moving like shadows up the gravel path. Inside they found Judith Langridge hunched over the great marble hearth. Flames licked at a pile of paper already curling into ash. Her face, lit in orange and red, was pale but resolute. She did not turn when they entered. Grange stepped forward. "That's enough, Mrs. Langridge." She dropped another folder onto the fire. Poirot moved quickly, reaching into the flame with the fire iron and dragging out what he could. Half-burned documents spilled onto the carpet, old maps, annotated deeds, and letters in Lord Everdale's distinctive handwriting. Judith rose slowly, brushing soot from her fingers. "You're too late," she said. "It's all gone." "Not all," Poirot replied softly, lifting a scorched sheet with a gloved hand. "Enough remains." Grange gestured to the constables. "We'll need to search the rest of the house." Judith gave a bitter laugh. "He told me he would ruin everything, that he'd found what my grandfather buried." "Do you know what it is to carry history like a yoke, Inspector?" Poirot spoke gently. "Number, but I know what it is to be betrayed by one's legacy." She turned on him, eyes gleaming with restrained fury. "My family built this village, preserved it. We gave it meaning, and Charles, he wanted to tear it all down, sell it to builders, turn the green into car parks and grocery stores." "You could have fought him legally," Poirot said. "He was the law, Monsieur Poirot. He controlled the trust. Once the gala began, he would have shown everyone these letters, exposed my family's past as false, built on stolen land. My name would have meant nothing. Langridge would have meant nothing." Grange stepped in. "So you killed him to stop that?" Judith's eyes flashed. "Number the Y only wanted to delay him, discredit him. I staged the threat, the disguise, the ribbon. I hoped to frighten him, to buy time." "You disguised yourself," Poirot said. "As a performer?" "Yes, I wore one of the old gala costumes, the mask, the wig. I meant to confront him anonymously, to tell him he wasn't untouchable." "But someone else knew what you planned," Poirot said, "and used your theatre as a curtain for murder." Judith went still. Poirot continued. "You became a perfect distraction. But someone else entered that carousel after you and ensured that Lord Everdale would never speak again." Judith shook her head slowly, a mix of horror and realization dawning. "Then it wasn't me, but someone used me." Poirot looked at Grange. "We'll take her into protective custody for now, not as the killer, but as the one who danced too close to the truth." As the constables led her away, the last of the documents smouldered in the hearth. Poirot watched them, expression unreadable. Grange crossed his arms. "So now what?" Poirot turned slowly. "Now we turn on the lights. The final shadow hides in plain view, and they have one more performance to give." Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the hills, and the carousel waited, its music box heart silent, its horses frozen mid-gallop, ready for the last spin. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The next morning, a cool hush settled over Marbury-on-Avon like a final breath before revelation. The rain had passed, and the village awoke to a clean, pale light. The fairground stood deserted, its attractions dormant under a soft mist. Yet in that stillness Hercule Poirot felt something stirring, a conclusion, slow but inevitable, gathering itself behind every spoken word and every concealed glance. Poirot stood beside the carousel, hands clasped behind his back as the morning sun reflected on the lacquered horses. He was not watching the ride. He was watching memory. The place of the murder, the place of the message. Grange approached from behind, boots crunching the gravel. "Judith is secure," he said, "still claims she only meant to scare Everdale." "And she did," Poirot replied. "But someone else was listening, someone who knew fear makes the perfect fog behind which to act." He turned to Grange, eyes sharp. "I asked you to retrieve something for me from the Burnley archives?" Grange held up a leather-bound ledger. "Estate guest logs from the last 2 years." "Bon," Poirot murmured, flipping through the pages. "Now, do you recall Celia Burnham's claim that she left the committee meeting early?" "Yes," Grange said. "She said she was humiliated and walked out." Poirot stopped at a page near the back of the ledger and tapped his finger gently. "Then why," he asked softly, "did Lord Everdale list her as a visitor to Burnley the next morning at 6:20 a.m.? Grange blinked. "That's hours after the body was found." "Indeed, and he was already dead, so who made the entry?" Grange frowned. "Could be a mistake." "Or," Poirot said, "a trap. Set by Everdale, who suspected he was being watched, manipulated, a test to see who would attempt to alter records. Someone did." Grange leaned in. "You're saying someone wrote her name after his death?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, to establish a connection or distance. But they made an error. They signed it C. Burnham, not Miss C. Burnham, as she always signs. Only one other person in the committee had access to the ledger and a reason to forge it." Grange's face tightened. "Rain." "Oui," Poirot said. "The solicitor, the quiet one. He benefited from Everdale's murder more than any other, his debts forgiven, his position elevated, his complicity in land misdeeds buried." Grange exhaled. "You think he framed Celia?" "More than that. I believe he feared she had seen something that night. Perhaps only a shadow, a gesture, a scent, but enough to place doubt in his mind." Poirot turned toward the carousel one last time. "The killer was not theatrical," he said. "He was practical, efficient. He let others wear the masks, Judith, Celia, even Felix. But it was Rain who acted when the stage was set. While Judith played the ghost and the village watched shadows, he stepped in and silenced the only man who could ruin them all." Grange's expression darkened. "Shall I bring him in?" Poirot nodded. "But quietly. Tell him there is one more question about the estate deed. He will come, because he always does." Grange turned to go. Poirot remained, his eyes on the frozen horse where Lord Everdale's lifeless body had once leaned. It had taken the whole village to build the illusion, but only one man to make it fatal. And now the illusion was ending. The final turn of the carousel was at hand. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. By late afternoon, the drawing-room at Burnley Grange had been cleared of its usual clutter. Chairs had been arranged in a semicircle beneath the chandelier's crystal light, and the heavy drapes were drawn just enough to allow in the grey-gold gleam of a setting sun. Poirot stood at the centre of the room, as though on a stage, calm, collected, ready. One by one, the suspects arrived. Judith Langridge, no longer in custody but under quiet watch, entered first, her expression stony. Felix Hargrove followed, his composure as cool as ever. Dr. Fenwick, arms folded, remained toward the back. Celia Burnham arrived nervously, casting glances at Poirot but saying nothing. And finally, Halbert Rain entered with the practiced neutrality of a man accustomed to legal formality. Grange closed the doors behind them. Poirot stepped forward. "Messieurs, mesdames," he began, "we are gathered here not simply to name a murderer, but to unravel the knots of deception that have plagued this village since Lord Everdale's death. You have each kept secrets, some out of fear, others out of ambition, but now the time has come to lay bare the truth." He turned first to Judith. "You, madam, disguised yourself that night, hoping to intimidate Everdale into backing away from his revelations. Your mask and costume provided the perfect misdirection. But you were not the killer." He turned to Celia. "And you, mademoiselle, witnessed a shadow. You were not sure what you saw, but someone knew you had seen something. That is why an entry was forged in the Burnley guest log in your name after the murder." Celia's eyes widened. "I know," Poirot said gently. "It was not you. It was someone trying to implicate you preemptively." He moved on. "Mr. Hargrove, your financial ties to the Grange and the Langridge legacy are deeper than you admitted, but though you manipulated and though you stood to gain, you did not kill." Felix said nothing, only adjusted his cufflinks. Poirot paused, letting the silence tighten. "Number, the person who killed Lord Everdale did so with the calm of a man who weighs consequences as carefully as he weighs ink upon a contract. A man who saw the Carousel as a stage, but let others play the actors. A man who feared exposure because he knew what Everdale intended to reveal." Poirot turned at last to Halbert Rain. "You, monsieur." Rain looked up, startled, but only faintly. "You forged the ledger entry. You planted the knife. And most importantly, you wrote to Everdale the night before his death, warning him to stay silent. A letter found in the ashes of the Grange fireplace, half-burned, but signed with your name." Rain's mouth opened, then closed again. "You used Judith's disguise," Poirot continued, "as a cover. You followed her to the Carousel. You waited until she had gone. And then, dressed plainly, you approached Everdale under the darkness of early morning and struck. A single blow, clinical, clean." Poirot's voice dropped. "You are a man used to the shadows, but shadows do not hold forever." Rain stood slowly. "You have no proof." Poirot gestured, and Grange stepped forward with the guest ledger, the burned letter, and the synthetic horsehair wrapped in evidence paper. "No," Poirot said softly. "No proof? Then let your silence answer for you." Rain's face twitched. Then slowly he sat again. The others stared, some in shock, some with a dark, dawning understanding. Poirot smoothed his lapel. And thus the carousel stops, the riders dismount, and the painted smiles fade into memory. Chapter 16. The Reveal. The room was so still that even the distant ticking of the mantel clock seemed to echo. Halbert Rain sat motionless in his chair, every eye fixed upon him. His carefully constructed facade of discretion, of quiet professionalism, was cracking under the scrutiny. Poirot, always a master of stillness, allowed the silence to stretch. When he finally spoke, it was with the calm confidence of a man who had traced every thread to its origin. "Let us review," he said gently. Lord Everdale discovered discrepancies in the original deeds to Burnley Grange. He realized that your legal ancestors, Monsieur Rain, had, how shall we say, assisted Madame Langridge's family in seizing control of the fairground land generations ago. Rain did not speak. Rather than challenge this through official channels, he intended to expose it at the gala using records, maps and letters, documents you helped him handle. Which means, Poirot said, stepping closer, you knew precisely what he held. Poirot turned, addressing the room. Judith Langridge, believing Everdale meant to destroy her family's legacy, chose the path of symbolism, a costumed confrontation meant to rattle him. But she underestimated the true danger. For while she acted out of desperation, someone else acted out of calculation. He looked back to Rain. You saw your opportunity. With Judith drawing attention and suspicion falling naturally upon her, you committed the murder. Quick, quiet, efficient. Poirot opened the envelope containing the charred edge of a letter, its signature still visible. You wrote to Lord Everdale, one final attempt to dissuade him. He ignored it. And so, in the hours before dawn, you met him at the Carousel under the pretense of discussing terms. Poirot paused, voice now quieter. You stabbed him in the base of the skull with a stiletto kept in your possession, a ceremonial item from your office, one you believed untraceable. You wiped it clean and hid it under Flinch's caravan, planting suspicion upon a man already disliked. You burned the ledger page. You forged Celia's name. You created confusion to mask the simplicity of the truth. Rain exhaled slowly, then straightened in his chair. He would have ruined everything, he said at last. Not just my reputation, but the legal standing of this entire village, the gala, the land, my practice, my name. Felix Hargrove stood abruptly. You arrogant fool. You think your name outweighs a man's life? Rain didn't flinch. That man destroyed people for sport. Poirot nodded. Perhaps he did, but justice is not ours to enact with a blade. Rain's shoulders sagged. It was never meant to go so far. Judith's plan was perfect. She would frighten him. He would leave. But he laughed. Even then he laughed, as though we were all beneath him. Grange stepped forward, slipping cuffs from his coat pocket. Halbert Rain, you are under arrest for the murder of Lord Charles Everdale. Rain made no move to resist. As he was led from the room, Poirot turned to the others. The Carousel was more than scenery. It was a mirror, a symbol of how easily we spin in circles, each of us chasing illusions while the truth stands still. He bowed his head briefly, then walked to the window. Outside, the wind stirred the daffodils along the garden wall. Somewhere in the distance, the faint chime of the Carousel's music box played, as if from memory, sweet, strange, and just a little sad. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The following morning dawned brighter than any in the week past, spring sunlight laying a golden wash over the village green, as though nature itself had been waiting for resolution. Birds chirped with tentative hope, and for the first time in days, the Carousel sat unguarded, its painted horses glinting peacefully beneath the sun. Inside the Marbury Constabulary, Halbert Rain sat silently in a holding cell, dressed not in the immaculate grey suit he had worn at every meeting, but in plain linen, the colour of resignation. He had made no effort to plead innocence, nor had he offered confession. His silence, Poirot observed, was not one of defiance, but of wearied inevitability. Inspector Grange stood at Poirot's side, arms folded, watching the man who had nearly orchestrated the perfect crime. "Never thought it'd be him," Grange muttered. "Too quiet." Poirot tilted his head. "It is often the quiet ones, mon ami, who listen more than they speak." And what he heard, through records, whispers, omissions, became the brush with which he painted his escape. Grange turned. "And now," Poirot said gently, "he must reckon with the truth. The legal consequences will follow." Outside, the village was stirring. Judith Langridge had withdrawn from public life, her once commanding voice absent from the Preservation Society's meetings. Felix Hargrove had issued a terse statement through his solicitor denying all knowledge of Rain's actions, though whispers already said his financial dealings were being quietly reviewed. And Celia Burnham? She had returned to her small cottage by the West Lane, where daffodils still bloomed untended. But now, when she passed through the village, people greeted her not with suspicion, but with softness. She had endured what none of them could: doubt, fear, and the looming weight of unspoken truths. Poirot visited her the day after Rain's arrest. She met him at the garden gate, her hands still stained with soil. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly. "There is no need, mademoiselle. It is I who should thank you," Poirot replied. "Had you not found the courage to speak of what you saw, even in fragments, the shadows might have held their secrets forever." She nodded, eyes glistening. "I was afraid I'd only made things worse." "On the contrary," Poirot said, "you helped bring clarity. Sometimes the truth does not arrive as a trumpet call. It arrives like light through lace, subtle, delicate, but unmistakable." They stood in quiet for a moment, the scent of damp earth and new growth hanging in the air. "Will you stay for the next gala?" she asked suddenly. Poirot smiled. "Ah, no, my business here is finished, and though I admire your fairground very much, I find I prefer quieter amusements." She smiled in return. "Safe travels, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot tipped his hat and walked back down the lane, his steps measured, unhurried. Back at the Marbury Arms, he packed his valise with practiced efficiency. Grange met him at the door. "You'll not stay for tea, then?" the inspector asked. Poirot shook his head. "Alas, no. There is always another question somewhere in the world. Another mystery, oui?" Grange nodded. "This one was a masterclass." Poirot chuckled. "Ah, but you forget, Chief Inspector. The murderer provided the illusion. I merely noticed the seams." And with that, Poirot stepped into the morning sun, the case of the painted carousel horse behind him and the road ahead gleaming with promise. Chapter 18. The Closing Remark. 3 days later, Hercule Poirot sat alone at a table on the terrace of a small tea-room overlooking the River Avon. A pot of Darjeeling steamed beside a plate of neatly sliced toast fingers, and the April sun warmed the tablecloth just enough to tempt the first bees of the season. Though his valise was packed, his train ticket folded crisply in his coat pocket, he lingered as if waiting for one final thought to arrive. He was not a man to rush resolution. No, Poirot believed deeply in the symmetry of endings. The murder of Lord Everdale had been as meticulously staged as any drama Poirot had ever encountered. But now, with Halbert Rain awaiting trial, the portrait of the crime stood complete, or nearly. From the footpath, a familiar figure approached. Celia Burnham, dressed simply in a pale blue coat, a journal tucked under one arm. "I'm not interrupting, I hope?" she asked. "Not at all, mademoiselle," Poirot said with a smile, rising and gesturing to the empty chair. "You grace the moment with charm." She sat, folding her hands on the table. "They've announced the new committee." "Ah," said Poirot, "and will you serve again?" "I will," she said with a nod. "This time, on my own terms." Poirot regarded her with quiet satisfaction. "You are stronger than you believe, Miss Burnham. Even the timid robin, when it sings, can silence the storm." She smiled faintly. I suppose I've been afraid for so long that I didn't notice when the fear began to leave. Poirot's gaze lingered on the river for a moment. Then he spoke, his tone gentle but firm. There is something else I should tell you, about Lord Everdale. Celia looked up, surprised. Poirot continued. Before his death, he wrote not only to the Historical Society but to one more person, his solicitor in London. In that letter, he expressed concern for a young woman in the village, a woman whom he believed had been unjustly treated, whose father had died under the weight of Everdale's legal manoeuvrings. Celia's eyes widened. My father? Poirot nodded. Yes, the letter was not only a confession, it was an apology. He had recently arranged for a portion of the Grange estate to be set aside in a private trust for you. Tears shimmered at the corners of her eyes. I never knew? He never told you, Poirot said gently, because he could not. Pride is often the armor of the guilty. She looked away, the wind lifting strands of her hair. So why tell me now? Because truth, mademoiselle, must be complete. A crime is not merely the act, but the story around it. And stories deserve their final page. They sat in silence for a moment longer. Then Celia stood. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot, for everything. Poirot bowed his head. Au revoir, mademoiselle. May your carousel always turn in light. She walked away, and Poirot watched her until she rounded the lane. As he sipped the last of his tea, Poirot retrieved a small notebook from his breast pocket and wrote a single line. Justice is not vengeance and truth is not cruelty. It is the quiet restoration of balance. He closed the notebook, paid his bill, and rose to leave. The wind stirred the trees, and from the far-off fairground came the faint sound of laughter, innocent, bright, untainted. Poirot smiled to himself. The painted carousel horse would ride no more with death upon its saddle. Its circle was complete, and so was his.